Even before the first humans set foot beyond the solar system, the galaxy already bore scars from countless wars and unspeakable horrors. Of these, one legend endured above all others, passed down by every species that had survived her wrath. Zelia. Her name was rarely spoken, and when it was, it came like a shuddered breath, a half-prayer to forces both vengeful and forgotten. She was no ordinary conqueror. No mere tyrant. For those who had witnessed her in action, if they survived, spoke of a presence that defied logic. She carried no armies, no vast fleets, and no planet-crushing superweapons. Zelia herself was enough. There were stories, of course. Thousands of them, whispered in taverns across the star clusters or etched into databanks of long-abandoned colonies. One told of how she confronted the Calixi, a reptilian race whose dread cruisers could glass entire planets. Their flagship, the Orcs Crown, carried an unbreakable security system. No outsider had ever set foot inside without authorization. Until Zelia. She walked through their corridors as if she had the access codes burned into her mind. When she reached the bridge, the captain didn't even have time to draw his weapon. Zelia left the ship with his severed head in her grip, the crown jewel of their fleet left adrift in space. Then there was the incident with the Vothuri Hive swarm mind that consumed civilizations, assimilating all living beings into their collective consciousness. Most species had no defense against the Vothuri's telepathic reach. But Zelia did not flee. She entered their central hive on Xerxes Prime and emerged days later, the entire swarm turned upon itself. The hive ripped its own drones apart, leaving only silence in her wake. What made her all the more terrifying was the mystery of her origins. She was not a human, nor a Calixi, nor any of the other known species catalogued in the Interstellar Union's archives. Some claimed she was a relic from a time before recorded history, a being forged in the ashes of a forgotten galaxy. Others whispered that she was a punishment sent by the universe itself, a being born not of flesh and blood but of vengeance and will. What was certain, though, was her effect on the galaxy. The alien empires of the time learned to tread carefully. They formed uneasy alliances, set aside petty squabbles, and even refrained from the kinds of extermination campaigns that had been common for eons. Zelia did not need to conquer. Her reputation kept the galaxy in check. When humanity first ventured into interstellar space, their encounters with the ancient and powerful species of the galaxy were filled with wonder and awe. They marveled at the towering crystal cities of the Zelethans and the living metal symbiotes of the Vaxura. Yet everywhere they went, in every cantina and every bazaar, they heard the name, Zelia. She's not like us, a blue-scaled merchant told one human trader. She's not like anyone. If you see her, you run. Humans, unshaped by the galaxy's ancient terrors, were skeptical. Their kind was young, ambitious, and still brimming with the confidence of a species that hadn't yet met its true test. So when an outpost on the fringes of human territory stumbled upon an ancient station in the Lambda 9 Nebula, the first thought was profit. The station was ancient, its architecture alien and unrecognizable. Walls pulsed faintly with an eerie light, and consoles displayed languages no one could decipher. It had been abandoned for longer than anyone could guess until a lone scavenger named Triss entered its deepest chamber and found something he could never have expected. There, beneath layers of frost and cold stasis, was a woman or something like one. Her features were sharp, her form both familiar and alien. Her eyes, though closed, seemed to see straight through him. Triss wasn't a scholar. He wasn't a historian. He was a scrapper, a prospector. He didn't know her name. But the sense of dread that filled him as he stared at her still, frozen form was enough to make him hesitate. He should have left. He should have turned and run back to his ship, sealed the station behind him, and warned his people to never return. But curiosity got the better of him. With trembling fingers, he touched the console next to her pod. Lights flickered to life. The frost began to melt. And as her eyes opened, her name swept through the galaxy once more. The hiss of escaping air filled the room as the ancient stasis pod began to open. Triss took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. The chamber had been silent for centuries, its frosted walls bathed in a pale, unearthly light. Now, for the first time in eons, it came alive, and so did she. When the pod's lid slid back, the woman inside didn't move at first. Her skin glistened with condensation, and for a moment, Triss wondered if she was still frozen. Then her chest rose, a sharp intake of air breaking the stillness. Her eyes opened, and Triss felt as though they pierced right through him. They weren't human. Too bright, too clear, their colors shifting subtly like a field of stars. For a split second, he thought he was looking at some kind of hologram, a trick of the ancient machinery. But no. She was real. And very much awake. She sat up slowly, her movements controlled and precise, as if every muscle in her body knew exactly what to do after all that time. Her gaze swept the room, taking in her surroundings before settling on Triss. He froze, unsure if he should speak, move, or run. Every instinct told him that whatever or whoever she was, he had no business being here. "Year?" she asked, her voice calm and measured. Not harsh, not angry, but with an edge that suggested she already suspected the answer. Triss' voice cracked, and he swallowed hard. 2113, Galactic Standard. For a long moment, she said nothing. Her expression didn't change, but her gaze flickered to the frost-covered walls, the dim lights, and the shattered remains of a console to her left. Something about her stillness made the room feel heavier. Triss shifted nervously, not daring to break the silence. "They're all gone, then," she said finally, more to herself than to him. Triss blinked. "Who?" "Everyone who mattered." Her tone was hard to read, no grief, no regret, just a flat acknowledgement. She swung her legs over the edge of the pod and stood. Though her posture was relaxed, her presence filled the room. Triss realized he was gripping his scanner tightly enough that his knuckles had gone white. "Wait, who? Who are you?" he managed to ask. Her head tilted slightly, as if she were assessing him. "You woke me, didn't you?" I didn't mean to dash," he gestured to the console, which was still sputtering faint light. "I didn't know what this place was, I just dashed." "You were curious," she interrupted. Her voice wasn't unkind, but it carried a weight that made Triss stop mid-sentence. Curiosity can be a dangerous thing. Triss took a step back. "Okay, look, I don't want any trouble. I'm just a scavenger. I thought this place was abandoned. Didn't mean to disturb. Whatever you're doing here." "I was sleeping," she said simply. She took a step forward, and Triss instinctively raised his hands, though she made no move to harm him. Her expression softened, if only slightly. "You're human." "Yeah." He nodded, not sure if that was the right answer. "First wave of colonists out this far. We're just trying to get a foothold." She regarded him carefully. "I've never seen a human before." "Interesting." Triss hesitated, his nervousness giving way to curiosity. What are you?" "I mean, everyone out here, the other species, they tell stories about you. I don't even know your name." For the first time, she smiled faintly. "I'm not surprised." She stepped past him, her bare feet making no sound on the cold floor. She didn't answer his question, not directly. Instead, she stopped by a cracked control panel on the far wall, her fingers brushing over its surface. The lights in the room grew brighter, flickering, as if responding to her touch. Triss thought he saw glyphs and symbols dance across the screen, but they disappeared before he could make sense of them. "What do they say about me, these others?" she asked without looking at him. "They?" Triss hesitated. "They're afraid of you. They say you're some kind of force. That you destroyed entire fleets, entire empires. Some think you're a myth. And what do you think?" Her gaze shifted back to him, sharp and expectant. Triss opened his mouth, then closed it. The woman in front of him didn't look like a monster. She looked human, almost. If not for her unsettling presence, the way her eyes seemed to glow faintly, the way the air seemed heavier around her, he might have thought she was just another person. But the stories had been so vivid, so frightening. Could they all be wrong? I don't know what to think, he admitted finally. You're not what I expected. That made her pause. For a moment, the faintest trace of amusement crossed her face. I never am. Before Triss could respond, she turned back to the panel, her fingers moving across it again. The screen flared to life, lines of code cascading in alien scripts. She seemed to absorb the information instantly, her expression unreadable. Tell me about your people, she said suddenly, her tone casual. My people? Triss echoed. Humans, she clarified. What role do you play in the galaxy now? We're new out here, Triss said. Still figuring things out. The other species, they're older, more advanced. We're just trying to survive, to learn. We're not. Well, we're not like you. She tilted her head, considering this. You're young. Yeah. I guess. And bold enough to wander where you don't belong. She glanced at him, something almost like approval in her gaze. That could be useful. Useful? Triss frowned. What does that mean? She didn't answer directly. Instead, she took a step toward him, her stance relaxed but her eyes piercing. This galaxy was built on fear and dominance. I have no interest in repeating what's been done before. But you. Humans. Perhaps you'll prove more interesting than the others. Triss didn't know what to say. Everything about her, the calm authority in her voice, the way she carried herself, left him off balance. She wasn't what he had expected. She wasn't a monster, not exactly. But she wasn't just a woman in a pod either. Something about her felt inevitable, as if her presence in the galaxy would ripple outward, changing everything it touched. I think, she said, it's time I see what this new galaxy of yours has to offer. When Triss first met Zelia, he figured their paths would split as quickly as they crossed. He'd stumbled onto something ancient, powerful, and way over his head. Surely, she would vanish into the stars, leaving him with little more than a wild story. But no, she didn't leave. Not immediately, anyway. It was strange how she stuck around. After waking from centuries of stasis, she could have gone anywhere, done anything. Yet she asked Triss to explain the galaxy's current state. She listened intently as he described the scattered human colonies and the new interstellar treaties. She questioned him about trade routes, frontier stations, and alien species, as if she were piecing together a puzzle that only she could see. At first, Triss was uneasy. Every time she looked at him, he felt exposed, like she could read his thoughts. But over the days that followed, she showed no sign of aggression. If anything, she was still curious. She asked about his homeworld, about human culture, about the exploration drives that sent people like him out into the unknown. And despite his better judgment, Triss found himself talking. He told her about his childhood on a small mining outpost, about the thrill of scavenging lost tech, and even about the long stretches of loneliness that came with it. She listened carefully, her attention never wavering. He learned a few things about her in return, little fragments she let slip. She had once commanded respect through sheer force of will, she admitted. Entire fleets had bent to her. Empires had altered their policies at the mere mention of her name. But now, she seemed uninterested in her old ways. The galaxy had moved on, she said. The powers she once challenged had crumbled or disappeared entirely. The enemies she remembered were ghosts. You're still a legend, Triss told her one evening as they sat in the outpost's small mess hall, the faint hum of life support systems filling the silence. The Calixi, the Vorthuri, what's left of them, they still talk about you. They're terrified of you. She stared at her cup of nutrient broth, her expression unreadable. Fear fades. So does power. The galaxy is nothing like the one I left behind. You don't seem afraid of losing it, Triss said. Power was never the goal, she replied. It was a means to survive. To endure. But what do you do when the fight is over? When the reasons for that power no longer exist? She looked at him. Your kind is new. Unshaped. You don't carry the same burdens. Triss shifted in his seat. I don't know about that. We've had plenty of wars. We're just smaller than the rest of the galaxy right now. Doesn't mean we're innocent. Maybe not, she said. But you see things differently. That's what I need. Her words caught him off guard. You need me? She smirked, the first hint of humor he'd seen from her. Don't let it go to your head. I need a guide. Someone who understands this era, who can help me learn its rules. If I'm going to do anything in this galaxy again, I need to know what's changed. Do anything? Triss asked. Like what? Zelia didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing as if she were looking at something far away. Something different, she said at last. Something better. He wanted to press her further, but just then the outpost's alarm sounded a low, mournful tone that made his stomach drop. He rushed to the control room, Zelia close behind. The station's sensors showed several alien ships approaching fast. The symbols on the screen were clear, Calixi vessels, war-painted and bristling with weapons. Triss felt his chest tighten. Damn, he muttered. They must have gotten wind that you're awake. Zelia's face remained calm as she studied the display. What will they do? They'll try to kill you. That's what they do. And what would you do? Triss froze. The Calixi were dangerous, relentless. He had no loyalty to them, no reason to defend their actions. But fighting them seemed suicidal. Running might not even work. He glanced at Zelia, expecting her to look ready for battle, but she wasn't. She seemed almost thoughtful. I don't know, he admitted. I'm just a scavenger. This isn't my fight. Yet here you are, she said. Caught in it. Her gaze turned back to the console. Tell me more about these Calixi. Their leadership. Their politics. How they think. Triss blinked. Now? Yes. Now. Despite the rising panic, he found himself talking. He explained what little he knew, how the Calixi clans had fractured after their empire fell, how their warlords constantly vied for dominance, and how they viewed humans as little more than pests to be tolerated. He mentioned their obsession with honor and revenge, how they couldn't stand any slight going unanswered. As Triss spoke, Zelia seemed to be analyzing each word. She asked sharp, pointed questions, making him clarify details he hadn't thought important. Before long, he realized that she wasn't planning to fight them head-on. She was figuring out how to confront them without lifting a weapon. When the Calixi ships arrived, Zelia didn't rush out to meet them. She didn't threaten them, didn't fire a single shot. Instead, she opened a comm channel and spoke directly to their warlord. Her voice was steady, her words carefully chosen. She reminded them of their fractured state, their diminished glory. She pointed out how hunting her would only waste resources they couldn't spare. And then she offered them something they hadn't expected, a chance to walk away without losing face. She told them they could leave without being branded cowards, without drawing attention to their weakened position. She gave them an out. To Triss's amazement, they took it. The ships turned and left, their warlord unwilling to risk a costly battle for a victory that wouldn't matter in the long run. Zelia watched them go, her expression unreadable. Why'd they back down? Triss asked once the sensors confirmed the ships were gone. Because I gave them a choice, she said simply. And because I understand how they think. Triss shook his head, still trying to process what had just happened. You really don't need me, do you? You've got this all figured out. I need your perspective, Zelia said, her tone measured. The galaxy doesn't operate the way it used to. I may know how they think, but you know what they've become. That matters. Triss wasn't sure he believed her, but he decided to stick around anyway. In the days that followed, they left the outpost together, venturing into the wider galaxy. Triss served as her guide, pointing out the changes that had occurred in her absence. She, in turn, shared glimpses of her past, small, guarded pieces that hinted at a far more complex history than any of the legends had told. Little by little, Triss realized he wasn't just guiding her. He was learning from her. The more they traveled, the more he saw that Zelia's true power wasn't just her strength or her legend. It was her ability to understand, adapt, and navigate a galaxy that still feared her. And maybe, just maybe, she could teach him to do the same. The day the alien fleet arrived was no different than any other. The human outpost in the Lambda 9 Nebula had long settled into a routine, bustling with traders, researchers, and the occasional scavenger looking to strike it rich. Triss had been lounging in the common area, tuning his gear and half listening to the ambient chatter when the first alerts came through. He barely had time to check the console before the images lit up, a Calixi warlord's flagship, flanked by a dozen heavily armed escort vessels. They'd arrived without warning, their weapons primed, and their course locked directly on the outpost. Word spread quickly, and within minutes the entire station was a hive of activity. People grabbed what they could and headed for escape shuttles, their faces pale with fear. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. Zelia was on the outpost. They had come for her. Triss caught sight of her standing near the main viewport, watching the approaching fleet with a calm intensity. There was no panic in her posture, no urgency in her movements. She looked out at the alien ships the way one might regard a storm on the horizon, formidable, but not unexpected. "They're not going to just talk this time," Triss said as he approached her. "They came to finish the job." Zelia glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "They've always been predictable." Triss shook his head, barely able to believe how composed she was. "You don't get it. There's nothing left to bargain with. They'll destroy this place just to get to you." "They'll try," she replied simply. That wasn't reassuring. Triss glanced at the display again, his stomach twisting as the fleet drew closer. He didn't know what he had expected when Zelia first woke up, but it wasn't this. Now the most feared being in the galaxy stood next to him, outnumbered, and apparently unwilling to fight back. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I'm going to show them they don't need to be afraid anymore," she said. Before Triss could question what she meant, she stepped toward the control panel. "Open a comm channel," she instructed. The officer on duty, her hands trembling, hesitated. "What?" "Do it," Zelia said. Her voice was steady but carried a weight that made the officer comply without further argument. The comm channel flickered to life. The face of the Calixi warlord appeared on the main screen, sharp scales, heavy armor, and eyes burning with hatred. He leaned forward, his fangs bared. "Zelia," he hissed. "You should have stayed buried." Zelia regarded him coolly. "You've traveled far to see me, warlord. Tell me, what is it you hope to achieve?" "What I hope?" The warlord's voice was full of scorn. "What I hope is irrelevant. What I will achieve is your end. No more fear. No more shadow over the Calixi." "I see," Zelia said. Her calm response seemed to unnerve him, even as he bristled with anger. "You think you can talk your way out of this?" the warlord snapped. "Do you know how many have tried to challenge me since you disappeared? You may have ruled through fear once, but those days are gone. And yet here you are," Zelia said softly. "Still clinging to that fear. Still trying to prove something." The warlord's eyes narrowed. "I'm here to erase the memory of you." "No," Zelia said, stepping closer to the viewport, as if she could look him in the eye through the vacuum of space. "You're here because you think you can win. But you don't know how to let go of the past. You see me as I was, not as I am." Triss stood frozen, watching the exchange. He had no idea what Zelia was doing, but something about the way she spoke, the deliberate calmness in her voice, made even the station's crew pause. The warlord shifted uncomfortably, his bravado starting to crack. "I could destroy you now," the warlord growled. "I could end this station and you with it." "You could," Zelia said. "But then you'd still be what you've always been, a hunter chasing a ghost. And what would that prove?" The warlord didn't answer immediately. The silence hung heavy in the control room. Everyone was waiting for the signal that the Calixi would fire, that the station's destruction was inevitable. But the longer Zelia stood there, unarmed, unapologetic, the more the situation began to shift. Let me offer you a choice, Zelia said, her voice firm. You can continue this path burning what remains of your people's strength in the name of vengeance, or you can step back. Leave here with your dignity intact, and start building something that matters. The galaxy has already changed. It's time you did as well. The warlord glared at her, his sharp claws tapping against the console in front of him. He wanted to strike, that much was clear. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the realization that even if he won, it would be a hollow victory. Or perhaps, deep down, he recognized the truth in her words. Whatever the reason, he finally leaned back in his chair, his expression hard. This changes nothing, he said coldly. But I'll leave you to your new galaxy. For now. The screen went dark, and the crew watched in stunned silence as the Calixi fleet turned and began to retreat. No one dared to speak until the last ship disappeared from the scanners. Only then did the officer at the console look up at Zelia. What just happened? She asked. Zelia stepped back from the controls, her gaze shifting to Triss. He chose a different path, she said simply. Triss stared at her, still trying to comprehend what he'd just witnessed. You knew he wouldn't attack, didn't you? I knew he had a choice, Zelia replied. What he did with it was up to him. The station's tension began to ease, though no one could fully relax in the presence of someone who had just turned away an entire fleet without lifting a weapon. Triss realized then that Zelia's power wasn't just in her reputation. It wasn't about fear or destruction. It was her ability to reshape the rules of the galaxy, to force even its most hardened warriors to confront the possibility of change. Later, as the outpost's crew began to rebuild and the news of the event spread, Triss and Zelia stood on the observation deck. The nebula outside shimmered with soft colors, its beauty a stark contrast to the chaos they'd narrowly avoided. So, what now? Triss asked. Zelia didn't answer immediately. She gazed out at the stars, her expression thoughtful. Now, she said at last, we see what this galaxy can become without fear. And for the first time since waking her, Triss felt a flicker of hope.